Very nice. I love this image. That was a 1 minute long exposure of this beautiful landscape that we have here, including the van on the side of the cliff. I am in Northern California. Today I'm gonna cross the border into Oregon pretty soon. This image is just the first of the many long exposures that I'm planning on making today, because we have the perfect day for that. It is windy, it is wet, it is cold. Jokes aside, it is stunning out here. It is the perfect landscape, the perfect place for long exposures. And if you stick around and come along with me, I'll tell you everything about how I go with long exposure photography, how I compose my shots, how I get the settings for the right exposure, the gear that I use, and even a little bit of post-processing at the end. I hope that sounds good. Let's do it. What a difference an hour and a half and some 50 miles can make. The morning fog is totally gone, and now we are left with a very sunny and bright day. Not ideal for long exposure photography at the coast, but we'll have to do with what we have. The good thing is I drove this stretch of the coast yesterday with much better conditions. I made some good, I think, images, some good long exposures that I'll show you in this video later. I'm going to assume you already know what a long exposure is, but long story short, it's a technique that allows us to go from this to this. I think a much more important question is why? Why would anyone want to make a long exposure instead of a regular shot? I think it comes down to whatever photography is for you. This is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. Everyone is going to be different. But for me, photography is a way to create an illusion, to create a world that is very similar to the one we see every day, but it's still slightly different. That's also why I shoot in black and white, because it's a degree of detachment from reality, if you will, already. And long exposure photography is just another way to push it even farther. I just love that long exposure lets us create something that we can't see with our eyes. The rain and especially the wind are your enemies when making long exposures. That is exactly what we have today. It's a rainy, very windy day, so I'm struggling with my long exposures. That's why I'm here. It's a somewhat protected spot. I'm trying to photograph those rocks in the background with a longer focal length. I'm shooting this at 100 millimeters, and it's working so far. The wind is especially annoying. It makes your long exposures blurry, and that is a very bad feeling when you spend several minutes working on one image just to find out that it didn't work out. As you can see, it's pretty windy now. Good thing the long exposure is done. This was a 2-minute long exposure. Turned out pretty bright. I think there was something wrong there with the exposure. Gonna take it again, another 2 minutes. But again, as you can see, it can be a challenge to make long exposures in these conditions. Whoa! The rain is also annoying, just slightly less so, but when you get drops on the filters, well, that can ruin the whole image of what you are trying to go for. So you have to be constantly cleaning those filters with a cloth or something. In my case, my t-shirt. Probably not the best day to do this, but I only have a couple days here at the coast, so I have to try at least. Okay, this exposure is done now. Hopefully it worked this time around. It looks better, but it's a little bit blurry because of the wind, so I'm gonna have to try again, sadly. Most of the long exposures I make are anywhere between 1 and 10 minutes. I've done much longer than that, several hours in the past for some things like the full moon, star trails. We're not going to talk about those kind of long exposures today because they are a totally different animal. They require some post-processing. So we're going to focus on the 1 to 4 minute territory here. Now, the sensor in your camera is way too sensitive to light to keep the shutter open for that long. So that's why we need ND filters to make long exposures. I've used everything from welding glass when I was just getting started. Is the cheapest way to do it. The quality takes a toll. They add a huge color tint, but they are, in my opinion, the best way to get started with long exposure photography, to get you started experimenting with this technique. After welding glass, I used for a while the big rectangular or square ND filters. Those were pretty good, but they were also pretty big and hard to carry around, to move around with you. So that's why now I've been using for a while now these case circular magnetic filters. They are much smaller. They are 82 millimeter filter threads, so they can still fit all of the lenses that I have, and they are very practical to carry around with you. I can just put them in my pocket. Now, like everything in life, you can go as expensive as you want here, and these things are not cheap. And because I tend to shoot in bad conditions and I carry a lot of gear with me for photo and video, well, I tend to break my ND filters quite a lot. Thankfully for me, they were okay this time. But that's not always the case. I've broken quite a few in the past. Another very important piece of gear that you might not need is the shutter release. Many new cameras have a feature where you can set the exposure time in camera. You don't need a cable. My camera is not that fancy, so I need to carry this around all the time. And the third and last thing we need for long exposure photography is, of course, a tripod. As with the filters, the more you spend on a tripod, the better, the higher quality is going to be, the more stable it's going to be. But again, you have to keep in mind the diminishing returns, because a $1,000 tripod is not going to be 10 times more stable than a $100 tripod. I personally use this common travel tripod. It's a very inexpensive one. I think it's around $150. You can find the link to all of these products, by the way, in the description down below if you want to support my work and buy using those links. And those three things is all we need to get started with long exposure photography. Actually, another piece of equipment that can be very useful, very helpful if you find that your long exposures are usually blurry. I'd say that is even more important than upgrading your tripod, especially if you shoot with long focal lengths, like say longer than 50 millimeters, or if your lens is big and heavy, is to get a tripod collar like this one, because that balances out the weight of the camera and the lens much better. Now the anchor point is more where the center of gravity is, if you will. If I attach the camera itself to the tripod, there is a lot of weight in the front, and that is going to make the whole thing much more unstable. And actually, another piece of equipment that can be helpful as well, besides ND filters, is a polarizer. So this is a good example of what a polarizer can do for us in any kind of photography, but it's especially important for long exposure photography, as we'll see. Keep your eyes on the water and see what happens as I rotate the polarizer. As you can see, the rocks stay the same, but the water becomes brighter, and as I keep rotating the polarizer, going back to the initial position, it gets darker again. So that is going to have a great effect in the final result of the image, because what I want to do here is to make the water as bright as possible. I'm gonna overexpose this image and go for a high key one, for a high key long exposure. And now, of course, I only have to stack the ND filters on top of the polarizer in order to make the long exposure happen. This one is a little bit tricky because I am taking it at 135 millimeters and crop mode, so almost 200 millimeters equivalent. It's kind of windy, so I'm not getting a sharp result. Let's see now if this is any better. Okay, this is better. I'm taking another one. This is something that you want to do with long exposure no matter what. Take always 2 or 3 shots because you never know what's going to happen, because again, you don't see the final result until the long exposure is done, and you will be surprised. One thing I try to do, I don't know if it helps at all, but in my mind it does, is just I get as close as possible to the camera, blocking the wind. Again, I don't know if this works, but this one is again a little bit soft, but at least we got one, I think. Composition-wise, a long exposure is no different than a regular shot. The only thing that we need to be aware of is the elements that are going to change because of the long exposure. In this case, for example, is the water. There are not going to be any waves or ripples. It's just going to be negative empty space. What I usually do in post-processing, I add a little bit of grain to give those empty spaces some texture. I cannot believe the gorgeous day we are having today. I mean, it's horrible for photography, but it's so nice. It's sunny, but it's still 55 degrees. There is a little breeze. Temperature-wise, it's just perfect. All right, so let's talk about camera settings in low exposure photography. I try to keep it as simple as possible. All that matters is the shutter speed. That's what I'm trying to decide. Do I want this to be 1 minute? Do I want it to be 4 minutes? Do I want it to be even longer than that? And I go back from there. I reverse engineer the other settings. I don't really care about the ISO that I use as long as it's in a reasonable range. I don't really care about the aperture as well, as long as it doesn't change what I'm trying to do. So you can use tables, you can use an app for your phone. I just have one number memorized, and that is 15. 1/15 of a second, that is the exposure, the shutter speed that I need to get in camera, so that when I put the 10-stop ND filter in front of the lens, I get a 1 minute exposure. I hope that makes sense. Basically, what I have to do is I have to play with the aperture, with the ISO. I have to place other ND filters in front of the lens so that I get 1/15 here in the screen. At that moment, if I put the 10-stop ND filter on top of everything else, I know that the exposure time is gonna be 1 minute. And I go from there, because if I want 2 minutes, that means that I have to get an exposure instead of 1/15, 1/8, half the time. If I want 4 minutes, I need to get 1/4 of a second. If I want to get 8 minutes, half a second. It also works the other way around. If I want to get a 30-second exposure, I need a 1/30th of a second. And that's all I do. Again, I try to keep it as simple as possible. I don't mind shooting at ISO 500, 800. I don't mind shooting at an aperture of f11, as long as I get the shutter speed that I need here. Oh, very important. It almost goes without saying, but just in case, I use the timer feature in my camera. So after I press the shutter on the shutter release, the cable release, the exposure does not begin immediately, but the camera waits 5 to 10 seconds. The hope is that within 5 to 10 seconds, the vibrations that I added from touching things have stopped. I was hoping for some morning fog, but you don't win the lottery every day, do you? Still, I came to town because I wanted to photograph the lighthouse, and I think we can try something slightly different here, and I can show you how I do it, how I do this, because it's going to require some post-processing. This is going to be a blend of a long exposure and a regular shot. So the idea is to still smooth out the water, but get the light of the lighthouse when it's facing us, so the top of the lighthouse is bright, if that makes any sense. So again, That is going to require a regular shot when the light is pointing towards us, and the long exposure for the smoothing out the water part. So I'm gonna take the regular shot first. I'm gonna wait till the light is pointing towards us. And there you go. Take a couple, and now very important, without moving the camera because it has to be the exact same composition, we take the long exposure as usual. So in this case, blending the two shots didn't make much of a difference, but take a look at this other one I made years ago where you can see it clearly, the combination of the very smooth water with the big wave on the top left. Well, and just like that, my very short trip to the Northern California / Southern Oregon coast is over. It was not even a couple of days, but I think I got some good images, some good long exposures. I hope that with this video I made you more curious about this technique, because I think it offers you a lot of creativity, a lot of creative uses. Long exposure photography is definitely a very different approach from the way I usually shoot. It slows me down quite a lot. I can spend 1 or 2 hours at the same spot and come out with just 1 or 2 compositions. But anyway, I hope the video was useful. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.